The morning of October 27, 1942. Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier experimental aircraft testing facility, 60 miles north of Berlin, Chief Engineer Klaus Hoffman stood in Hangar Four, staring at wreckage that would change everything. German air commanders thought they knew about American strategic bombing. The pieces had been trucked in over 3 days, wings torn from a fuselage, a tail section peppered with holes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Engine cowlings split like tin cans, and everywhere empty ammunition boxes for .50 caliber machine guns. More boxes than any German bomber carried, more than any aircraft Hoffman had examined in 23 years of aeronautical engineering. The bomber had drifted from formation over the Ruhr, wounded by flak. Messerschmitt fighters had pursued it across 50 miles of German countryside, pouring cannon fire into its wings and fuselage. Yet even crippled, even dying, the American crew had kept shooting back until the aircraft finally lost altitude and crashed in a farm field near Duisburg. The fighters reported something unprecedented. They had never encountered such concentrated defensive firepower from a single aircraft. Now, as teams of German engineers began cataloguing every piece, they would discover that this crashed Boeing B-17 flying fortress represented not just a new American bomber, but a complete philosophical shift in aerial warfare doctrine. The Americans were not building bombers that relied on speed or altitude alone. They were building flying gun platforms designed to fight their way to the target and back. The discovery would terrify some Luftwaffe commanders and be dismissed by others. But for the engineers at Rechlin, the evidence was undeniable. The war in the skies over Europe was about to become far more deadly than anyone in Berlin had anticipated. In the autumn of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had been conducting daylight bombing, raids over occupied Europe for barely 2 months. On August 17th, 12 Boeing B-17E flying fortresses of the 97th Bomb Group, led by Major Paul Tibbets, had struck the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. This first heavy bomber raid by American forces achieved its objectives with minimal damage, creating a false sense of confidence on both sides of the conflict. The Luftwaffe High Command, observing these initial American operations, believed they understood what was coming. 4-engine heavy bombers were not new. The British had been flying Lancaster and Wellington bombers in night raids for years. The Germans themselves operated the Heinkel He 177 and Focke-Wulf F2 200 heavy bombers. What could the Americans possibly bring that would change the equation? The answer lay not in the aircraft's size or bomb load, but in a design philosophy that German aeronautical engineers had never seriously considered. The Boeing B-17 had been purpose-built from its earliest design stages to carry an unprecedented defensive armament. Where German heavy bombers typically mounted 2 to 4 machine guns, the B-17 carried 11 to 13 heavy machine guns, all firing the same .50 caliber ammunition, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that could engage attackers from virtually any angle. This defensive philosophy represented a fundamental difference in strategic thinking. German bomber doctrine, inherited from years of success in blitzkrieg operations, emphasized speed and the element of surprise. Bombers reached their targets quickly, dropped their ordnance, and departed before enemy fighters could organize effective resistance. The concept of bombers fighting their way through sustained fighter opposition had never been seriously planned for. The Americans, however, were planning to send hundreds of bombers deep into German territory in broad daylight, with missions lasting 6 to 8 hours, facing continuous fighter opposition. They needed bombers that could survive sustained attack. The B-17's heavy defensive armament was not a luxury, it was the cornerstone of American strategic bombing doctrine. But in October 1942, Luftwaffe intelligence knew very little about the true capabilities of the B-17. Reconnaissance photographs showed 4-engine aircraft with distinctive tail configurations, but photographs could not reveal the complexity of powered gun turrets, the quantity of ammunition carried, or the training American gunners received. The crashed B-17 at Duisburg represented the first opportunity for German engineers to examine an American heavy bomber in detail. Klaus Hoffman had joined the Luftwaffe testing establishment at Rechlin in 1936, when the facility was still expanding to support Germany's rapid rearmament. He had examined dozens of aircraft types, domestic and foreign. British Spitfires brought down over the Channel. Soviet Yak fighters captured on the Eastern Front, even a French B-17 fighter that had made an emergency landing in German-occupied territory. But this was different. The Boeing B-17 represented American industrial capability at a scale Germany could not match. The aircraft's construction quality was immediately apparent even in wreckage. Precision machining, standardized components, robust electrical systems. This was an aircraft built not in dozens but in hundreds, perhaps thousands. As Hoffman's team began their systematic examination, they started with the defensive armament positions. The upper dorsal turret had been blown completely off the fuselage in the crash, but enough remained to analyze its construction. It was a powered turret, electrically operated, with two Browning M2 machine guns capable of traversing 360 degrees in azimuth. The Germans had seen powered turrets before, but not with this degree of sophistication. The turret's ammunition feed system was particularly impressive. Each gun could be supplied with 400 rounds through a continuous belt feed system that rarely jammed even under sustained fire. German machine gun systems, while effective, were more prone to mechanical failures during extended combat. The American design philosophy emphasized reliability above all else. Moving aft, the engineers examined the ball turret position on the aircraft's belly. This spherical turret, manufactured by the Sperry Corporation, represented perhaps the most remarkable defensive position Hoffman had ever seen. Suspended below the aircraft's fuselage, it provided an unobstructed field of fire covering the entire lower hemisphere. Two more Browning M2 machine guns, 500 rounds each, operated by a single gunner who entered the sphere through the aircraft interior and was then lowered into position. The tail gunner's position had survived the crash relatively intact. Two more Browning M2 machine guns, mounted in a tail turret with limited traverse, but covering the critical rear approach angle. German fighter pilots had learned to attack from the rear when possible, staying outside the effective range of bomber defensive fire. But the B-17's tail guns could engage targets at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The waist gun positions, where flexible mounted machine guns were operated by standing gunners, added two more Browning M2s. The nose positions, though damaged, showed evidence of at least one more machine gun, possibly two. Hoffman's preliminary count reached 11 separate defensive gun positions, all firing the same .50 caliber ammunition. But the true revelation came when his ammunition specialists calculated the total ammunition load. Even accounting for ammunition expended during the aircraft's final battle and ammunition destroyed in the crash, the B-17 had carried somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. This was more defensive ammunition than most German bombers carried by a factor of 3 or 4. The engineering team worked through the night, measuring, photographing, cataloguing. By dawn on October 28th, Hoffman had prepared his preliminary report for Luftwaffe headquarters. The conclusions were stark. The Americans were deploying heavy bombers with defensive capabilities exceeding anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. More critically, if the Americans could produce these aircraft in quantity, the strategic bombing campaign over Germany would be far more costly to defend against than anyone in Berlin anticipated. Hoffman's report reached Berlin on October 29th and was immediately circulated among senior Luftwaffe commanders. The response revealed deep divisions within the German air staff about how to interpret American capabilities. Then, Colonel Adolf Galland, chief of day fighter squadrons, read the report with growing concern. Galland had flown combat missions since the Spanish Civil War and understood aerial combat better than most officers. He recognized immediately what the crashed B-17's defensive armament meant for Luftwaffe fighter tactics. At a meeting at Luftwaffe headquarters on October 30th, Galland provided his assessment to a room full of senior officers. His words would prove prophetic. It unites every possible advantage in one bomber. Firstly, heavy armor. Secondly, enormous altitude; thirdly, colossal defensive armament; and fourthly, great speed. Galland understood that attacking such aircraft would require new tactics, possibly new weapons. The standard Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter carried one 20mm cannon and two 7.9mm machine guns. Against a heavily armored bomber defended by 13.50 caliber machine guns, a fighter pilot would have to close to dangerous ranges to achieve hits with enough impact to bring down the bomber. The B-17's defensive guns, while not as destructive as 20mm cannon, could still tear apart a fighter at ranges where the fighter's guns were barely effective. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, State Secretary for the Luftwaffe and one of the few senior officers with serious industrial experience, drew more ominous conclusions from the report. Milch had visited American factories before the war and understood American production capacity in ways most German officers did not. After examining the crashed B-17's components, Milch met privately with senior staff officers. His comments, recorded in Luftwaffe documents later captured by Allied forces, revealed his deep anxiety. The Reichsmarschall told me that there is no cause for anxiety about the American aircraft, and that, four-engined though they may be, we can contemplate the future with equanimity. I told him that I do not agree. Milch elaborated on his concerns during a larger staff meeting later that month. These are worries I just cannot get over. We have got to accept that one day the enemy bombers attacking Germany will be flying at altitudes of 28,000 or 30,000 feet. He was referring to the B-17's operational ceiling, which exceeded that of many German fighters, especially at full combat load. A formation of B-17 Sekunde flying at 30,000 feet, each carrying tons of bombs and 11 heavy machine guns, would be extremely difficult to intercept effectively. Even if German fighters could reach that altitude, they would be at the edge of their performance envelope, with reduced maneuverability and firepower, while the bombers would be operating within their design parameters. But Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, dismissed these concerns. Göring's response, documented in multiple sources, reflected a dangerous overconfidence that would characterize German high command decisions throughout the coming air battles. At a commanders' conference in early November 1942, Göring addressed the reports about American bomber capabilities. His dismissive attitude would be remembered by those present. They may have 4 engines, they may carry heavy armament, but our fighters will knock them down just as we knock down the British bombers. Heavy bombers simply make larger targets. This divide between officers who understood the technical reality and those who clung to wishful thinking would plague German air defense efforts for the next 2 years. Galland and Milch represented the pragmatic faction, officers who looked at American industrial capacity and defensive armament and saw an existential threat. Göring and his closest advisors represented the optimistic faction, convinced that German fighter pilots' skill and battlefield experience would overcome any material disadvantage. The debate was not merely academic. German aircraft production, already strained by competing demands from the Eastern Front and North Africa, would need to be reorganized completely if the Luftwaffe was to mount effective defense against a sustained American bombing campaign. But reorganization required acknowledging the threat's severity, and Göring refused to do so. Meanwhile, in October and November 1942, American B-17 production was accelerating rapidly. Boeing's Seattle factory was producing approximately 80 aircraft per month. Douglas Aircraft had begun B-17 production at their Long Beach facility. Vega, a Lockheed subsidiary, was tooling up for B-17 production in Burbank. By mid-1943, American factories would be delivering more than 300 B-17s every month. The engineers at Rechlin, studying the crashed aircraft's components, could estimate American production capabilities from the standardization they observed. Every component was precisely manufactured to allow interchangeability. The same part numbers appeared throughout the aircraft. This level of standardization indicated mass production on a scale German industry had never achieved with complex military aircraft. Klaus Hoffman included these observations in his final report, submitted in mid-November. His conclusion was bleak. The Americans are not building experimental or small production-run aircraft. This bomber shows every sign of large-scale mass production. If they can produce hundreds of these aircraft, our fighter defenses will be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, regardless of the skill of our pilots. The report was filed, read by mid-level officers, and largely ignored by senior commanders. 2 months later, on December 12, 1942, a second B-17 would fall into German hands, this one virtually intact, and this time Luftwaffe test pilots would fly it. December 12, 1942. Leeuwarden Airfield, occupied Netherlands. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger brought his crippled B-17F down on the German-controlled runway with one engine dead and fuel streaming from punctured tanks. The aircraft, nicknamed Wolf Hound, had been savaged by Messerschmitt fighters during a bombing run over the Rouen marshalling yards. With his crew wounded and no hope of reaching England, Flickinger made the hardest decision a bomber pilot could make. He surrendered his aircraft intact to save his men's lives. Within hours, German ground crews swarmed over the bomber. Unlike the October wreckage, this was a complete, flyable aircraft. Every system could be examined in working condition. Every gun turret could be tested. Every ammunition feed mechanism could be analyzed. And most critically, German test pilots could fly it. 2 days later, on December 14th, a German crew prepared Wolf Hound for flight. The bomber's American stars had been painted over with German crosses. Luftwaffe identification codes DL plus XC were applied to the fuselage. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighters would escort the captured bomber to Rechlin, ready to shoot it down if the crew attempted to defect to neutral Sweden. The flight nearly ended in disaster. Despite advance notification to every German flak battery and fighter station along the route, nervous gunners opened fire on the unfamiliar silhouette. The B-17 took minor damage before the Messerschmitt escorts could wave off the attackers. When the bomber finally landed at Rechlin, Klaus Hoffman stood on the tarmac, watching the most important intelligence acquisition of the air war taxi to a stop. Over the following weeks, Rechlin's engineers conducted the most comprehensive examination of an enemy aircraft in Luftwaffe history. They measured every dimension, tested every system, fired every gun, and documented every innovation. What they discovered would confirm Klaus Hoffman's worst fears from 2 months earlier. The B-17F model carried 11 Browning .50 caliber machine guns as standard equipment, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the tail turret, 2 waist guns, 1 radio operator's gun firing upward, and 2 flexible nose guns operated by the bombardier and navigator. Total ammunition load exceeded 6,500 rounds. But the sheer number of guns was only part of the story. German engineers marveled at the sophistication of the fire control systems. The Sperry ball turret alone represented engineering far beyond anything in German bomber design. The gunner, sealed in a rotating sphere beneath the aircraft, could track targets through nearly the entire lower hemisphere. The turret's azimuth and elevation controls were hydraulically powered but electrically controlled, allowing the gunner to track fast-moving fighters with minimal physical effort. The top turret demonstrated similar sophistication. Mounted directly behind the cockpit, it provided coverage of the entire upper hemisphere. The gunner stood on a platform that rotated with the turret, giving him intuitive control. German-powered turrets, by comparison, were heavier, slower to traverse, and more prone to mechanical failure. Most impressive was the ammunition feed system. Each gun received its ammunition through flexible chutes that could bend and flex as the turrets rotated without jamming. German engineers had struggled with ammunition feed reliability in their own turret designs. The American solution was elegantly simple and remarkably reliable. The defensive fire control philosophy also differed fundamentally from German practice. In German bombers, defensive guns were considered secondary weapons, operated by crew members whose primary duties were navigation, radio operation, or bomb aiming. In the B-17, defensive gunnery was a primary mission. Half the 10-man crew were dedicated gunners with no other duties during combat. American gunner training, as German intelligence would later discover, emphasized volume of fire and mutual support. Gunners were trained to fire in short bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining constant defensive coverage. When a fighter attacked, multiple gunners would engage it simultaneously, creating intersecting streams of tracers that forced the fighter to break off or fly through a wall of .50 caliber bullets. The psychological impact on attacking fighters was profound. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting that attacking B-17 formations felt like flying into a storm of metal. Even if most bullets missed, the sheer volume of defensive fire was unnerving. Fighter pilots found themselves flinching, breaking off attacks early, or approaching from less favorable angles to avoid the heaviest concentrations of defensive fire. On March 17, 1943, Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche arrived at Rechlin to begin test flights of the captured B-17. Lerche, 29 years old, was already one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots. He had flown over 100 different aircraft types, from tiny reconnaissance planes to massive six-engine transports, but the B-17 represented his first opportunity to fly a captured American heavy bomber. Lerche approached the aircraft with professional curiosity, mixed with trepidation. The B-17 was substantially larger than anything he had flown previously. The cockpit, designed for two pilots, seemed enormous compared to German bomber designs, where the pilot often sat alone with minimal assistance. The pre-flight inspection took nearly an hour. Lerche methodically checked each control surface, examined each engine, tested each system. American design philosophy was immediately apparent. Everything was clearly labelled in English, which Lerche could read passably. Critical controls were colour-coded. Emergency procedures were posted on placards throughout the cockpit. The Americans designed their aircraft assuming that crew members might need to operate unfamiliar systems in combat emergencies. German aircraft design, by contrast, assumed expert operators who had memorized every procedure. There were fewer redundant systems, less clear labeling, more reliance on crew training. The American approach reflected their industrial philosophy. Build systems robust enough that even moderately trained operators could keep them functioning. Starting the four Wright Cyclone engines required careful attention to unfamiliar procedures. American engines used different primer systems, different mixture controls, different procedures than German power plants. Lerche had studied captured technical manuals, but written procedures could not fully prepare him for the reality of starting engines whose operation he understood only theoretically. The first engine caught on the third attempt, settling into a rough idle before smoothing out. The second and third engines started more easily. The fourth engine proved stubborn, requiring multiple attempts before finally firing. The sound was distinctively American, deeper, rougher than German radial engines, with a rhythmic pulse that Lerche found disconcerting. The B-17 weighed over 25 tons fully loaded, substantially heavier than most German bombers. The tailwheel steering was sensitive, and the bomber wanted to weather vane in crosswinds. Lerche found himself over-controlling initially, then gradually adapting to the aircraft's handling characteristics. Takeoff was straightforward but required decisive control inputs. Lerche advanced all four throttles smoothly, feeling the bomber accelerate down Rechlin's long concrete runway. At approximately 90 miles per hour, he eased back on the control column. The B-17 lifted off smoothly, climbing steadily at 1,000 feet per minute. Once airborne, Lerche began exploring the aircraft's handling characteristics. The B-17 was stable, almost ponderous in its responses. Control inputs produced smooth, predictable reactions, but with noticeable lag. This was an aircraft designed to fly straight and level for hours, maintaining formation with dozens of other bombers. Maneuverability was not a priority, but what the B-17 lacked in agility, it compensated for in stability and forgiveness. The aircraft wanted to fly straight and level. Trimmed properly, it required minimal control inputs to maintain altitude and heading. For formation flying over enemy territory for 6 or 8 hours, this stability would be invaluable, reducing pilot fatigue. Lercher spent 2 hours exploring the bomber's flight envelope. He flew at various speeds and altitudes, tested stall characteristics, practiced approaches and landings. His conclusion, documented in his official report, was sobering. The B-17 is an excellent bombing platform. It is stable, reliable, and remarkably easy to fly. More concerning is its altitude performance. At 25,000 feet, it handles better than most German fighters at similar altitudes. This last observation was particularly ominous. German interceptors, especially when carrying heavy cannon armament, struggled at high altitudes. The thin air reduced engine performance and maneuverability, but the B-17, with its turbocharged engines, operated comfortably at altitudes where German fighters were at the edge of their performance envelope. Over the following weeks, additional test flights explored the bomber's defensive systems. German pilots sat in each gun position, firing at towed targets to evaluate fields of fire and gun effectiveness. The results confirmed what ground examination had suggested. The B-17 could engage attackers from virtually any angle, and its concentrated firepower could tear apart a fighter that remained within range for more than a few seconds. The ball turret proved especially effective. Attacks from below, a standard Luftwaffe tactic against British bombers with minimal belly defense, were suicidal against B-17s. The ball turret gunner had an unobstructed view and could track targets through their entire approach. Several German pilots who participated in the tests reported that they would not want to attack a B-17 from below in actual combat. The tail guns covered the most common attack angle. German fighter pilots had learned to attack from dead astern when possible, using their speed to close quickly, fire a burst, and break away before defensive guns could track them effectively. But the B-17's tail guns, mounted in a powered turret with good visibility, made stern attacks far more dangerous than pilots expected. Only frontal attacks, where the bomber had just 2 flexible nose guns, offered relatively favorable odds for attackers. But frontal attacks required exceptional skill and nerves of steel. The closing speed between a fighter approaching head-on and a B-17 flying at its cruising speed of 180 miles per hour exceeded 500 miles per hour. A pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to line up his shot, fire, and break away before collision. By April 1943, Rechlin's analysis was complete. The final report, distributed to Luftwaffe fighter units throughout Europe, attempted to provide tactical guidance for engaging B-17 formations. The report emphasized that isolated B-17s were vulnerable. A single bomber, separated from its formation, could be attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming its defensive coverage. But B-17s flying in tight formation created interlocking fields of fire, where attacking fighters faced guns from multiple bombers. The Americans had developed the combat box formation specifically to maximize this mutual defensive coverage. 12 bombers flying in a staggered 3-dimensional formation could bring dozens of .50 caliber machine guns to bear on any attacking fighter. Some German pilots described it as like attacking a flying porcupine with guns bristling from every direction. The report recommended focusing on disrupting formations rather than shooting down individual bombers. If fighters could force bombers to break formation, either through aggressive attacks or by creating confusion, those isolated bombers became easy targets. Luftwaffe commanders began emphasizing tactics designed to scatter bomber formations before attempting to engage individual aircraft. But executing these tactics required fighters to fly through concentrated defensive fire to reach attack positions. Losses among German fighter units began climbing steadily throughout 1943. The bravest and most experienced pilots, who pressed attacks home despite defensive fire, died first. New pilots, seeing what happened to aggressive attackers, began breaking off attacks early, firing from too far away to be effective. Adolf Galland, now General of Fighter Aircraft, watched these developments with growing frustration. His October 1942 prediction had proven accurate. The B-17's defensive armament was changing the nature of aerial combat over Europe. German fighters needed heavier weapons to destroy the heavily armored bombers from outside the range of their defensive guns. But heavier weapons meant heavier fighters with reduced performance and maneuverability. The captured B-17 at Rechlin continued flying demonstration missions throughout 1943, visiting fighter bases across Germany and occupied France. Luftwaffe pilots studied its defensive armament, noting blind spots and vulnerable approach angles. But the knowledge gained came at a cost. The more German pilots understood about the B-17's capabilities, the more they respected and feared it. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, the pilot who had surrendered Wolfhound, would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp, haunted by the knowledge that his aircraft had provided the Luftwaffe with invaluable intelligence. But his decision to land intact, rather than attempting a ditching that would likely have killed his wounded crew members, saved 9 lives. In the brutal calculus of war that had to matter more than tactical intelligence, the captured B-17 would fly in German markings until April 10, 1945, when it was destroyed in an American bombing raid on Oranienburg airfield. By then, the Luftwaffe had examined multiple captured B-17s, tested dozens of captured .50 caliber machine guns, and developed tactics based on hard-won experience. But none of it changed the fundamental reality that Klaus Hoffman had identified in October 1942. The Americans had built a bomber designed to survive sustained attack, and they could produce hundreds of them every month. The war in the skies over Germany would be decided not by individual pilot skill or tactical innovation, but by industrial capacity and the willingness to accept staggering losses to achieve strategic objectives. August 17, 1943. The skies over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Germany. 291 B-17 flying fortresses penetrated deep into German territory, attacking ball-bearing factories and aircraft assembly plants. By nightfall, 60 bombers had been shot down. 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe claimed 288 kills, a wild overestimate reflecting the chaos of combat where multiple fighters often attacked the same bomber. But even the actual losses represented a catastrophic 16% attrition rate. At 16% losses per mission, bomber crews statistically could not survive the required 25-mission combat tour. For the Luftwaffe, the mission represented both victory and warning. Yes, they had inflicted devastating losses, but the Americans kept coming, and the cost to German fighter units had been equally severe. Hauptmann Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter pilots with over 200 victories, wrote to a fellow officer after the Schweinfurt raid. His words captured the reality that German test pilots at Rechlin had been warning about for months. Against 20 Russians trying to shoot you down, or even 20 Spitfires, it can be exciting, even fun. But curve in towards 40 fortresses and all your past sins flash before your eyes. 4 days later, Philip was dead, shot down during another attack on American bombers. Whether he fell to defensive gunfire from a B-17 or to P-47 escort fighters remains unclear. In the chaos of aerial combat, death came too quickly for certainty. The psychological toll on German fighter pilots was mounting. Every attack on a B-17 formation meant flying through walls of .50 caliber tracers. Pilots watched friends explode in mid-air, their fighters torn apart by defensive fire. Others returned with aircraft riddled by bullet holes, instruments shattered, control surfaces damaged. The bravest pilots died first, leaving units increasingly filled with inexperienced replacements who lacked the skill and courage to press attacks home. Klaus Hoffman, still analyzing captured aircraft at Rechlin, received reports from fighter units throughout Germany. The pattern was clear. Luftwaffe tactics were evolving, driven by desperate necessity. Frontal attacks, approaching the bombers head-on where defensive firepower was weakest, became increasingly common despite the extreme difficulty and danger involved. German aircraft manufacturers responded by developing specialized bomber-destroyer variants. The Focke-Wulf FTV 190A-8, equipped with additional armor and heavier cannons, was designed specifically for attacking B-17 formations. Some carried 4 30mm cannons, devastating weapons that could destroy a bomber with a few hits. But the added weight reduced speed and maneuverability, making these aircraft vulnerable to American escort fighters. The most radical development was the Sturmgruppe tactic, where heavily armored Focke-Wulf fighters formed dense formations and drove straight into bomber boxes, firing at close range and sometimes even ramming damaged bombers. These tactics achieved results, but at horrific cost. Sturmgruppe pilots had life expectancies measured in missions, not months. October 9, 1943. A second intact B-17 landed on German soil, this time in Denmark. The aircraft, misnonnally the second, suffered engine failure while attempting to reach neutral Sweden. Test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche flew it out of a farmer's field near Varde and delivered it to Rechlin for evaluation. This B-17F model showed modifications and improvements absent from the earlier captured aircraft. The nose guns had been upgraded with bulged cheek positions, allowing better fields of fire forward. Ammunition capacity had increased. The aircraft's overall condition, despite the forced landing, demonstrated American maintenance standards and manufacturing quality that continued to impress German engineers. Lerche noted in his flight test report that American bomber crews were becoming more experienced and their tactics more sophisticated. The combat box formation had evolved into an intricate three-dimensional array where individual bombers provided mutual support while maintaining tight enough spacing to concentrate defensive fire effectively. Breaking these formations required either overwhelming numbers of fighters or tactics so aggressive they bordered on suicidal. But the aircraft that truly alarmed Luftwaffe intelligence appeared in spring 1944. The B-17G model represented the Americans' response to German frontal attacks. A powered chin turret mounting two additional .50 caliber guns had been added beneath the nose, directly addressing the bomber's most vulnerable approach angle. Combined with improved cheek gun positions, the B-17G brought total defensive armament to 13 heavy machine guns. On March 3, 1944, another B-17 landed intact in German territory. Lieutenant John Grossage, piloting a B-17G from the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, made a navigation error while attempting to reach Sweden after heavy battle damage. He landed at Schleswig-Jagel airfield in northern Germany, delivering to the Luftwaffe their first complete example of the latest American bomber variant. The chin turret represented sophisticated fire control engineering, remotely operated by the bombardier using a gun sight and hand controls. It could traverse and elevate to cover the entire forward hemisphere, except directly ahead where the propellers would be struck. Two Browning .50 caliber guns, electrically fired, with 1,460 rounds of ammunition. German fighter pilots who examined the captured B-17G understood immediately what the chin turret meant. Frontal attacks, already requiring exceptional skill and courage, had become even more dangerous. The bomber could now engage approaching fighters at longer ranges with concentrated fire from multiple positions. The brief window for effective frontal attack had narrowed further. Adolf Galland, watching German fighter losses climb throughout 1944, understood that the air war over Germany had become unwinnable through conventional means. American industrial production had overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. In 1944 alone, American factories delivered over 8,000 B-17s. The Luftwaffe, even with increasingly desperate tactics, could not shoot them down faster than they were being built. The arrival of long-range American escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, fundamentally changed the strategic equation. Now, bomber formations were protected by fighters that could accompany them throughout their missions deep into Germany. Luftwaffe fighters had to fight through the escorts before reaching the bombers, and then fight through the escorts again while withdrawing. The defensive firepower that Hoffman had warned about in October 1942 was now supplemented by offensive fighter protection that made attacking bomber formations catastrophically expensive. The human cost of the air were manifested in statistics that revealed the brutal effectiveness of the B-17's defensive armament combined with escort fighters. The 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 men killed in action, but the Luftwaffe fighter force was effectively destroyed as a fighting force by spring 1945. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat died attacking American bomber formations. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training, lasted hours or days in combat. The B-17 gunners, flying mission after mission through hostile skies, developed an intimate relationship with their weapons. They knew every quirk of their Browning M2s, understood how to clear jams in seconds, could estimate range and lead instinctively. Many gunners never received credit for their victories, as multiple gunners often fired at the same target and attribution was impossible. But their collective firepower, multiplied across hundreds of bombers in formation, created defensive barriers that changed aerial warfare. The captured B-17s at Rechlin served multiple purposes throughout the war. German fighter pilots used them to practice attack approaches, learning to identify vulnerable angles and optimal firing positions. Engineers studied their construction techniques, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited. Intelligence officers analyzed every modification, tracking American improvements and attempting to predict future developments. But perhaps the most valuable intelligence came from simply flying the aircraft and experiencing what American bomber crews experienced. German test pilots gained profound respect for men who flew these missions day after day. The B-17 was reliable and forgiving, but it was not invulnerable. Flak could shred its aluminum skin. Cannon shells could tear away control surfaces. Fire could consume fuel tanks despite self-sealing technology. Yet crew after crew climbed into these aircraft and flew into skies, filled with fighters and anti-aircraft fire, knowing that their survival depended on their formation, their gunners, and simple luck. Klaus Hoffman compiled his final report on the B-17 program in December 1944. By then, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. German cities were being systematically destroyed by American daylight raids and British night bombing. The Luftwaffe, despite introducing jet fighters with performance far superior to any Allied aircraft, lacked the fuel, pilots, and infrastructure to mount effective defense. Hoffman's conclusions were stark. The B-17 represented a fundamental shift in strategic bombing doctrine. The Americans had built an aircraft that could survive sustained attack through defensive armament, armor protection, and robust construction. They had produced these aircraft in quantities that overwhelmed German defensive capabilities, and they had trained crews to fly them with discipline and courage that German intelligence had initially underestimated. The defensive armament that had so impressed German engineers in October 1942 had proven even more effective in combat than analysis suggested. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun, firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition at 750 rounds per minute, could tear apart fighter aircraft at ranges where fighter weapons were marginally effective. Multiplied by 11 or 13 guns per bomber, and then by dozens or hundreds of bombers in formation, the defensive firepower became overwhelming. But the B-17's greatest strength was not its guns or its armor or its bomb load. It was the industrial system that produced it, and the training system that created its crews. German aeronautical engineering was in many ways superior to American engineering. German fighter aircraft often had better performance characteristics than their American counterparts. But American industry could produce 10 aircraft for every one Germany built, and American training programs could replace losses faster than combat consumed crews. The legacy of the German analysis of captured B-17s extended beyond the immediate tactical implications. After the war, Luftwaffe, test pilots and engineers contributed to international aviation development, bringing lessons learned from examining enemy aircraft. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences testing captured Allied aircraft, providing valuable historical documentation. The fundamental question that German engineers confronted in 1942 remained relevant for decades after the war ended. How do you defend against an enemy with overwhelming industrial capacity and the will to accept massive losses to achieve strategic objectives? The B-17 and its crews provided the answer that shaped Cold War strategic thinking. You build systems robust enough to survive attack. You produce them in quantities that overwhelm defenses, and you train personnel to execute missions regardless of losses. The defensive armament philosophy pioneered by the B-17, influenced strategic bomber design for the next 2 decades. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the Convair B-36, and even early versions of the Boeing B-52 incorporated defensive gun positions. Only with the development of surface-to-air missiles and advanced jet fighters did the defensive gun turret finally become obsolete. For Klaus Hoffman and the engineers at Rechlin, the examination of captured B-17s represented a professional challenge unlike anything they had previously encountered. They were not simply analyzing an enemy weapon. They were confronting an entire philosophy of warfare that prioritized industrial capacity and systematic planning over individual excellence and tactical brilliance. The crashed B-17 that arrived at Rechlin in October 1942, the intact aircraft captured in December, and the subsequent examples examined throughout the war all told the same story. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war, one that Germany could not win through tactical innovation or superior technology alone. The defensive armament that so impressed German engineers was merely one component of a strategic system designed to deliver explosive tonnage to German targets regardless of cost. In the end, the B-17 Flying Fortress lived up to its name, not because it was invulnerable. Over 4,700 were shot down during the war, but because it kept flying, kept fighting, and kept returning despite losses that would have grounded less robust aircraft. The 13.50 caliber machine guns that German engineers examined so carefully in captured aircraft represented America's answer to German fighter superiority. Not individual excellence, but collective firepower. Not invulnerability, but survivability. Not perfection, but overwhelming numbers. The engineers at Rechlin understood this by early 1943. The commanders in Berlin understood it too late. And by the time they did understand, American bombers were already overhead, their defensive guns bristling, their bomb bays full, writing the final chapters of the war in smoke and fire over German cities. The fortress had proven itself not through impregnable defense, but through the simple, terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare. Build enough of them, train enough crews, and accept the losses. The outcome was never really in doubt, once the bombers began to fly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.